Hey, everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. We are talking about Israel and the war in Gaza, and we're asking the question, where is the truth, or what is the truth? We hear all kinds of stuff on social media regarding this subject, and sometimes it's hard to discern where the truth is. So, in order to address that, I have brought on Dr. Michael Brown, returning guest. He's been on a few times, and he is going to tell us about his perspective and weigh in on the situation in Gaza. Of course, Dr. Brown is an American radio host, Christian author, apologist, and activist. And I also have Lewis, who's going to be joining me and also asking some questions here and there, kind of playing devil's advocate. Well, welcome back to the show, Dr. Brown. How are you? It's an honor to have you.
Thanks, Michael. Great to be with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lewis, good to have you as well. I know we double booked you here, so you're working a lot today.
Hey, I'm happy to do it because this is a topic that I follow a lot as well, and I do want to try to help make better sense of it because it is a complicated issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I say let's kind of start with the beginning here, not the beginning, Genesis beginning, but maybe the beginning of the establishment of the state of Israel. Dr. Brown, if you could maybe walk us through that. How exactly was the nation of Israel established?
Right. So bear in mind, as the Jewish people have been in exile over the centuries, there's always been the longing to be back in the homeland. Jews pray, when they pray in the synagogues in their homes, they pray facing Jerusalem. Every Passover Seder, every year, you say next year in Jerusalem. Many of the daily prayers include prayers for the regathering of the exile, the reestablishing of the nation of Israel, etc., the rebuilding of the temple. So this is part of the longing, part of the process that's been in the hearts of Jewish people over the centuries. As for the region that was named Palestine after the Second Jewish Revolt in 135, that has never been a specific homeland, a state. So different peoples have lived there. It's once with the conquest of Islam, it was largely Muslim. There's always been a Christian population there as well. And there's been a Jewish population that's been small. The late 1800s, when the great majority of the inhabitants of what was called Palestine were Arab, but still the land was largely desolate and undeveloped, that's when more numbers of Jews began to come back to the land. As anti-Semitism was increasing around the world, and then the birth of the Zionist movement in response to anti-Semitism in France and elsewhere, and the pogroms in Russia. So more and more Jews would come back, buy land, begin to develop the land. That brought with it then an increase of Arabs coming into the land as well. So there was no problem. There was plenty of room for everybody at that point. And there was no attempt to establish a homeland again for the Jewish people, just a regathering. So the relations were largely peaceful into the 1920s when pogroms began against the Jewish people. When Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who became a confidant of Adolf Hitler, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, launched the first Intifada, the slaughter of the Jews in Hebron, the false charges that they were going to take over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the same charges that you hear to this day that incite the masses. So after World War I, Great Britain was given responsibility for this region. In 1937, the Peel Commission came up with a plan to say, hey, look, let's give about 20-something% of the land to the Jewish people, 70-something% of the land to the Arabs, and then we'll have some under international control at Jerusalem. The Jewish leaders really struggled with it, but were willing to accept it. The Arab leaders 100% refused. Well, now in the aftermath of the Holocaust, Jews pouring into the land. So the UN partition plan is drafted in 1947. So that is not as much room now for the Arabs as the Peel Commission. But again, it's a two-state solution. The Jewish leadership accepted it. The Islamic leadership 100% rejected it. And when Israel declared its independence, even before that, they began to attack. When Israel declared its independence in 1948, they said, we will drive you into the sea. There is literature, documents, the actual evidence of it, of the leaflets that were passed out in Israel in the name of David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir and others, saying there's room here for everyone. Stay. You're our neighbors. But in the midst of war, 800,000 Jews from surrounding nations and in Africa, etc., the Muslim nations were expelled by the countries there. And the vast majority of them made their way back to Israel, which now had to incorporate all these things. About 700,000 Arabs living there had to leave. Some left in the midst of battle. It's a war zone. We want to get out of there. Some left following the directive of the Arab leadership, who said a cannon can't distinguish between a Jew and an Arab. So get out. We'll drive them into the sea, then come back and take your homes. And some fled because of the Jewish attacks in the midst of the war. So that's the origins. Two-state solutions were presented in 37 and 47, both rejected by the Arab leadership. Ultimately, that's how the state was reformed, and Israel's been in the battle for its existence ever since.
Now, there have been many Palestinians and even non-Palestinians who claim that Israelis stole land from the Palestinians, and they cite the Nakba. Can you maybe talk about that and briefly address that?
So al-Nakba in Arabic, the catastrophe, is how the Arab and Muslim world refers to the founding of the State of Israel. It was first used in its earliest usage. It had to do with the defeat of the 5 surrounding armies that attacked Israel in 48 and failed catastrophically. That was the original meaning of the Nakba. Then it ultimately became the larger catastrophe of the expelling of these people. So did the Jews steal land? First thing, there was no stolen land up to 1947. There can be no accusation that Jews stole land. They bought property. They developed property. There was no seizing of property violently, none. I recently saw a little clip from an Israeli tour guide saying, give me one example, just name one city, one village, one plot of land that was stolen by the Jews prior to the partition plan in 1947. With the partition plan, now a war breaks out, and in the midst of the war, Israel's fighting for its very existence, and there is now going to be some expansion. In other words, so some land is taken that goes a little bit beyond the partition plan. So once the State of Israel is established in 1948, in the war, some land has been taken, but there was nothing stolen. There was a partition plan voted on by the UN, accepted by Israel, rejected by the surrounding peoples, who then attack and try to destroy them. Israel fights for its right to exist. In the midst of it, it is a war, and no war is conducted perfectly. But Israel, remember, accepted the two-state solution, and the Arab leadership rejected it. That's the historical fact. Nothing was stolen from the Palestinians.
And before I move on to my next question, I think, Luis, you have a follow-up there.
Yeah, so I do have a couple of questions relating to the land stealing argument. So one has to do with what you just mentioned about purchasing land, because from what I've heard from some sources, the land was purchased from sort of like absentee landlords, like the Arabs who sold them to the Jews didn't actually live there. So when they were sold, it was the ones who were actually living there that got the short end of the stick. The other one concerns what happened at 1947 and shortly afterwards. So you might be familiar with the work of the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, who wrote a book, The Ethnic Cleansing of the Jews. And he discusses Plan Dalet, which was a plan by the Haganah to sort of like clear out a bunch of the Arab villages that they thought, might pose a threat to the Jews. And this is cited as an example of how the Jews at 1947, even before the war formally began, were already removing Arabs from the land. And at some points, it actually led to violent conflicts. So the Deir Yassin massacre, which happened just a few miles west of Jerusalem, is often cited as an example of, the Haganah actually engaging in violence against Arab residents in the land. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, thank you for raising those. So with regard to the selling of land, the people who owned it. They had the right to sell it. So if I own a house and you were living in that house, I own the house and sell it, you have to leave that house when the new owners come in. That's just legitimate. There's nothing stolen there whatsoever. It's a legitimate purchase. And remember, when you just have to look at the surge of Arab population in the land from late 1800s to early 1900s. Why? Because Jews were successfully developing the property and creating more jobs and opportunity. And the Arabs were the ideal ones to care for the land, etc. So they were coming in and not having jobs. That's the first thing. The second thing is Elon Pape is a well-known propagandist. That take a scholar like Benny Morris, called one of the new historians, and would be left-leaning in many ways. Benny Morris has excoriated the work of Elon Pape. Pape is on record as saying sometimes it's not history, it's the ideology that you want to communicate. So in terms of among the radical anti-Israel scholarship, Pape is respected. In terms of the wider branch, his work has been thoroughly exposed. And Benny Morris, in his analysis, considered one of the most fair-minded historians, has said, yes, there were some atrocities committed. Deir Yassin got completely exaggerated. And then the fear of that caused other Arabs to flee. But in point of fact, Benny Morris says, as far as wars go, and how Israel carried out the war, the atrocities are less than what you would normally hear of and expect in the midst of a war. So it is a war. And remember also that you have different factions within Israel. You have some that were more like the vigilantes, and then the formal army. Ultimately, it's the formal army that carries out the policies and what becomes the IDF. But Elon Pape should not be used. Ephraim Karsh, Karsh, has a whole book called Palestine Betrayed, where he goes through the source documents and lays out, after 50 years, these were released a few years ago, lays out who did what, who said what. And then he actually has a book called Fabricating Israeli History, where he shows the false narratives that have been put forth. But if someone just wants to get a voice respected on all sides, Benny Morris, and it's uncomfortable because they'll show you where everybody blew it. But in the midst of war, Israel conducted itself in a way that was more ethical and honorable than would normally be the case. In the midst of it, are there certain atrocities? Absolutely. These become the norm, and these become now exaggerated as if Israel was this monster trying to ethnically cleanse the land of Palestinians. Let's remember that from the time of Israel's independence, when about 200,000 Arabs stayed in the land, they have now become more than 2 million. That is hardly ethnic cleansing. The population of Judea-Samaria, called the West Bank, has gone up, I believe, fourfold. The population of Gaza has gone up over twofold. So I don't know how this is ethnic cleansing when all the peoples living there have multiplied dramatically by hundreds of percent over the decades.
Now, in that case, what are the actual facts behind Plan Dalit then? Was it actually a clearing out of Arab villages, as a lot of people comment on it suggest, or is that misrepresentation of what Plan Dalit was?
I'm not an expert on it. I want to be totally honest in that regard. There is controversy, but I can say this for sure. There was no pre-1947 agreed on national Israeli plan as to how to cleanse the land of Arabs. If there were pockets that were considered to be violent, dangerous, trying to kill us and attack, by all means, try to remove them, as any nation would do. We'd do the same thing if that was in our backyard here in America. But to my knowledge, there was no nationally accepted plan that was then implemented to cleanse areas of Arabs.
Now, I'm curious about your reaction to news with some in the ICC, the International Criminal Court, who are seeking arrest warrants, especially against Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. And they're citing things like genocide being committed in Gaza. Can you weigh in on that for us?
All right. So first, to be totally clear, the blood of a Palestinian child is just as precious in God's sight and should be just as precious in our sight as the blood of an Israeli child.
Amen.
And that being pro-Israel as I am does not mean I agree with everything Israel does, and it does not mean that I am anti-Palestinian. And I was just reading accounts earlier this week, of a doctor that went in to try to help in the hospitals in Gaza, and the horror stories and what he's seeing and the suffering children. So I always want to be sensitive to that. I don't want to minimize the suffering. But to me, it is an absolute outrage that Netanyahu can be called by the International Court for war crimes, just along with the leaders of Hamas. I see no possible moral equivalence whatsoever. And let's understand, Hamas's intent from their initial charter has been to wipe out the state of Israel. There can be no Jews there. Remember that Hamas is Islamist. They are not primarily nationalist. They are Islamist. Their flag is not the Palestinian flag, but an Islamic flag. They are part of the Muslim Brotherhood. So Jews are living in land that was previously Islamic land, and that is an affront to Islam. Jews cannot be there. They must either be annihilated or expelled. That's the only alternative. There is no two-state solution for Hamas. That's why a Hamas leader recently said, we will do October 7th over and over again until there is no more Israel. That is their intent. That is their heart. So when it comes to genocide, Israel overnight could wipe out all the people of Gaza easily, very, very easily. They could, without any extraordinary effort, because of their military and because of the nature of things there in Gaza with their Air Force, they could just bomb the whole thing and wipe everybody out. If their intent was genocide, they're doing a very bad job of it. Number one, they've been accused of genocide for decades. Bear this in mind. This is not a new charge. Just research it. They've been accused of genocide really since 1948. And remember, Hamas says the issue doesn't start with this war now. It doesn't start with 1948. It goes back over 100 years. So there can be no Jewish presence there. They must be gone. Bear in mind also that with talk of a two-state solution under the more moderate Palestinian Authority with Mahmoud Abbas, no Jews can live in that state. It must be, in the German phrase, Judenfrei, free of all Jews. So you have over 2 million Arabs living in the land as fellow citizens with members of the Supreme Court and the Knesset and all of this. But if there's a Palestinian state, not a single Jew could live there. Again, this tells you the difference in mentality. But in short, if Israel wanted to commit genocide, they could easily do it. They have just successfully relocated about 1 million, slightly under 1 million Palestinians out of Rafah, where they're conducting their last military offensive against the Hamas leaders. Before they began to bomb, they urged everyone, evacuate to the south. They dropped hundreds of thousands of leaflets in Arabic saying, we are coming after Hamas here, leave. They on a regular basis, they make calls. They have people's numbers on cell phone into their homes saying, you have terrorists. There's a terrorist enclave in your building. Your building is about to be bombed. You need to leave. I have friends whose kids serve in the IDF, or young people I've talked to who serve in the IDF. They will tell me the checklist they have to go through before they can fire a weapon, before they can act to guarantee that civilians aren't hurt. So we can talk about what Israel's done wrong. We can talk about whether there are any valid war crime accusations against Israel. I'm happy to do all that. But there is no moral equivalence. One side is doing its best to minimize civilian casualties in the midst of wiping out Hamas. The other side is doing everything it can to inflict civilian casualties. In Israel, when there's news of Palestinian children being killed, they don't celebrate in the streets. They don't hand out candy. When a Palestinian is killed, they don't drag the body through the city rejoicing, whereas that's what happens in Gaza. And we've seen the footage of it, all of us, to the breaking of our hearts.
When you speak of that checklist that they kind of have to go through, what do we do with instances like the World Central Kitchen, or I think of the two Catholic women who were shot in a church? Are those maybe instances of individuals who are kind of going rogue, who possibly do have an intention to target civilians, but that's not reflective of the IDF as a policy? Or do you think that there's some other explanation?
There may be some that go rogue. The best I can see, it's very serious error, and Israel immediately acknowledges it and says that we did it and we're investigating it. But let me just give you a few examples. 3 Israeli hostages, 3 men, were able to break free. Israel misidentified them and shot them. They shot their own hostage. One of the most heartbreaking things, these people get free. They're sending out SOS signals, but Israel thought that they were just being lured into something. They shot their own people. It shook the whole nation. It's estimated right now that 20% of all the IDF deaths in Gaza right now are friendly fire. So Israel has killed its own and is grieving over it and has acknowledged it in published the detailed reports. There are massive protests in Israel. When you hear accounts of say, relief worker being shot by Israel. There's outrage over Israel. Just go to the Haaretz website. This very left wing, large publication there. Every day they're excoriating the government, blaming the government. So Israel has blown it. I'm sure here and there you have a rogue soldier who, in anger, kills someone he shouldn't kill. But the vast majority of it, as best as I can see, is in a very, very difficult situation. They're trying to take people out, and they've taken out the wrong people. They've even done it with some of their own, and we know that's not intentional. So it's a very difficult place of engagement, the nature of how the battle's being fought. Remember that almost 300 IDF soldiers have been killed since Israel launched its offensive there. The reason for it is because they're trying to conduct the warfare in a certain way and minimize civilian casualties, which puts them at much greater risk. So that's reality. Again, it doesn't minimize Palestinian suffering, and it doesn't mean Israel's guiltless. But as best as I can tell, it is very serious human error as opposed to attempts to kill innocent people.
Now, we're also hearing people equate criticism of the IDF and the nation of Israel with anti-Semitism. What exactly is anti-Semitism? Where is the line when it comes to this situation?
It's a very important question to ask, because you can be critical of a Jewish person without being an anti-Semite. You can be critical of the state of Israel without being an anti-Semite. You can even say that you don't believe, as a Christian, biblically, that there's a connection between modern Israel and biblical prophecy. That doesn't make you an anti-Semite. So anti-Semitism is Jew hatred. That's the simple aspect of it. And it is Jew hatred in a collective way. So, for example, if you had a nasty Jewish boss and said, my Jewish boss is really nasty, that's not anti-Semitic. If you say all Jews are nasty, that's anti-Semitic, right? If you say that Jewish leaders were complicit in the death of Jesus, that's historical fact. If you say all Jews through all time are Christ killers, that's anti-Semitic. When it comes to the modern state of Israel, Natan Sharansky gives this threefold guideline that I think is helpful. That if you demonize the nation of Israel as a whole and paint it as genocidal, ethnic cleansing monsters, that's anti-Semitic. If you delegitimize it, that Israel has no right to exist, that's anti-Semitic. Or if you use double standards, that you hold Israel to one standard and its enemies to another standard, that's anti-Semitic. So I would say in that regard, that's true. But remember, within Israel, Israel's fiercest critics are fellow Israelis. And some of the most extreme rhetoric that you'll get against Israeli leadership, against Netanyahu, etc., is within Israel. And you have groups like B'Tselem that are human rights groups constantly critical of Israel, that are Israeli run. You try to do that under the Palestinian Authority or under Hamas, you're dead the next day. So Israel is one of the most self-critical nations you'll find, but anti-Semitism goes to a different level.
You know, one thing I often hear in these discussions is, well, of course, you have 1,200 dead on October 7th, but then others say, but look, there's 30,000 or more people dead with, it, the war in Gaza. And so they say this is a disproportionate response on part of Israel. Weigh in on that for us.
Yeah, again, I'm so glad you're asking all these questions. Number one, who reports on the death toll? Hamas. Hamas is the one giving out the figures. Number two, the UN and other bodies just recently basically halved some of the figures. They said that the numbers we have are way off. Number three, who is the combatant? How many of these people were Hamas soldiers? If let's say there are about 30,000 Hamas soldiers from what we know from general reports. Let's say half of them were killed. It's 15,000. Let's just say the number 30,000 was correct, which from my understanding, the numbers have been reduced fairly dramatically. Let's just say it was correct. Let's say half of them were terrorists and half civilians. A one-to-one correspondence, as brutal as it sounds to us, is actually very low for war. And Hamas quite intentionally positions itself in such a way, this is the goal, so that when Israel attacks them, their own civilians will be killed, which then makes Israel into a pariah state in the face of the entire world. So I can only say that it's absolutely tragic, but the vast the vast weight of the blame falls on Hamas for positioning itself the way it does, for having terror tunnels under hospitals, for having weapons in schools, for launching in populated areas. Yahya Sinwar, the major Hamas leader now, who's in hiding in Gaza, he's on record as saying to free a Palestinian prisoner, if it cost us 100,000 of our own people, fine, it's worth it. There are other Palestinian leaders on record saying, if a few million die, so be it. We are a nation of martyrs. So it's a brilliant, horrific strategy, and it works effectively because now Israel becomes the evil party. But remember, the numbers are being reported by Hamas, number one. Number two, it's been acknowledged that they've been highly inflated. Number three, we don't know how many are actually combatants. And if the number of combatants that have been killed is as high as we think, 15,000 or more, then this would make a one-on-one correspondence, which for war, tragically, is actually low.
Do you think that's maybe why the IDF doesn't come out with, very clear numbers on how many civilians have been killed? I mean, they do come out with numbers on, how many terrorists have been killed. But when it comes to civilians, it's hard to get a straight answer from representatives of the IDF.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they don't have access to all the data because Hamas is the one burying the people. They can only say, hey, we knew we took out these terrorists. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's embarrassing and they don't want to say. Maybe I honestly don't know. It's speculative. But what I can say is that you're not going to have the Israeli populace rejoicing over the reports of innocent women and children being killed. And the moment that the October 7th happened and the devastating news set in, I was speaking at a church in Texas the next day, had to change my message. Just my heart was completely broken and I wanted people to feel the weight of what was happening. But the very first day I said, please pray for the Palestinian people, because without doubt, when this is done, there are going to be more Palestinians dead than Israelis. It is just the nature of the way it happens, the way Hamas has embedded itself in the civilian population. And when Israel goes to take out Hamas, this is going to happen. And Israel, again, is fighting for its existence. So it's tragic. I don't want to downplay it. Where there have been missteps, hopefully it will all come to light. But to accuse Israel of seeking to commit genocide, which again has to do with intentionality, is absolutely bogus and false.
I have just a couple more questions, then I'm going to pass it over to Lewis and he's going to ask his. But I see somebody in the chat is trying to represent you as having said the numbers aren't accurate, therefore bombing civilians is justified. I don't think that was your argument. Can you maybe just clarify that for maybe anybody who misunderstood?
Yeah, so Michael, based on the list of questions you sent me, as my assistant said, he's obviously very thoughtful. And I know some of the questions are from Lewis. So I'm hoping that your viewers are also thoughtful. There is no possible universe in which what I said could be construed to have that meaning. What I'm saying is, don't talk to me about 10,000 babies killed if we don't know what the actual number is. I'm saying one baby, that's a tragedy. That's what I'm saying. And where Israel has not responded properly or did not follow proper protocol, then let Israel be held to account. But right now, we don't know all the numbers. We know the suffering is terrible. But I will say this. The main reason for the suffering of the people of Gaza right now is the evil deeds and actions of Hamas. If not for the massacre on October 7th, this would not be happening. If they did not take over in such a brutal way when they were voted into power. Remember, 17 years ago, Israel pulls out of Gaza, completely pulls out. There were thousands of Jews living there. They pull out completely, hand it over to the Palestinians, who then elect Hamas. Hamas then brutally purges the Palestinian Authority leadership. I mean, this is well known what they did, the brutality towards their competitors, and took over. And they are Islamist. You have these groups like Queers for Palestine. Go ahead, be a queer in Gaza for one day. Sir, go ahead and wear your dress in Gaza for one day. That'll be the last day of your life. Radical feminist wants to flaunt your body and I am who I am. And okay, do that one day. That's the last day of your freedom in Gaza. This is an Islamist. It's like the Taliban, like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS ruling because of that, with your next door neighbor saying, we want to wipe you off the map, Israel's had to isolate them in many ways. If they had leaders who had a like heart and said, let's live together in peace and let's thrive, everybody would be happy except for the radical right within Israel, which needs to be called out and isolated. But otherwise, this is what people have longed for. Before October 7th, this was the dream. And my Jewish friends who live side by side with Palestinians in the so-called disputed territories, they've worked as neighbors and co-workers and friends for years and said, why can't we do this on a broader level?
One thing I've noticed is that this topic, among others, it seems to be something hard to communicate with a lot of people, because I've noticed that they come to radical conclusions that don't follow from anything one has said. And that often happens to me. People will say, well, Michael is saying this, and it doesn't logically follow from anything that I've said. I think we just saw that with one of the commenters. I'm just curious on a personal level. Do you experience that pretty often, that people just completely take you out of context, or say that you're saying something when in fact that doesn't follow from anything you said?
Oh, 24/7. For example, let's say I got on your show and I said, I think Michael Lofton is a terrific guy. And then 30 seconds later, I see the attack. Why are you attacking him? Why do you say such a bad guy? Or conversely, when I have called someone out by name for error and sin, and then get the post, why are you defending him? No, that happens 24/7. So my frustration is not being attacked for what I believe, right?
Yeah.
Like if we differed about, Catholicism, Protestantism, whatever, and we had a discussion about that, so we have our differences, right?
Sure.
But if you get attacked for being an apologist for Martin Luther, and I get attacked as being an apologist for the Pope, it's like, come on, just get things right here. So no, it's a frustration, and I wish I had the time to sit with every person and to say, okay, why do you think that? Do you realize you've been misinformed? How can I help sort this out? But that's the nature of it. People don't think, they just see a meme and they respond emotionally. They pass on what they've heard because if it's on the internet, it must be true. But this is a perfect illustration. And I get it more extreme than that, literally 24/7.
I've noticed. Yeah, I've seen them do that to you. Like some of your comments on the Talmud, you offered thoughtful criticism, and then somebody equated you with being a Talmud apologist because you didn't buy into some bad arguments. People, by the way, did the exact same thing to me on the exact same topic. So I know. Yeah, I know.
Well, I'm not,
I know what
just,
it's like. So.
I'm not just an apologist for the Talmud. I am a Judaizing secret worker for ultra-Orthodox Jewish organizations trying to Judaize the church and pull them away from Jesus. Oh yeah, it's amazing. And I should be a rich man because I'm also employed by Mossad. Yeah, I found that out. So I'm just piling away all the money for all these different groups here.
Well, one last question before I hand it over here to Luis.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the solution here? Is there a solution?
Yeah. Okay. At present, no. Ideally and theoretically, yes. I say at present, no, because the indoctrination of the Palestinian people against Israel has been so deep, so profound, so widespread. Remember, you have state-run TV there in Gaza, and you have in Judea Samaria, the West Bank, that you have children's schools named after terrorists who blew up buses with Israeli children on them. And these are considered heroes. You have Hamas summer training camps where kids learn to be terrorists. So the indoctrination is so deep. And then the Palestinians have suffered under Israel. There's no question. And the people of Gaza now can look at what Israel is doing to us. And then, especially in the light of radical Islam, there is no practical solution. The ideal is that people would be more pragmatic, that, the Golden Meir thing, that peace will come when you love your children more than you hate ours, to, basically paraphrase, that ideally people say, look, let's have a better world for our children. How about that? And that Palestinian leadership said, we don't want to destroy you. We want to live side by side peacefully. We want to thrive and prosper. And if that was the case, then, quote, some type of two-state idea or a larger state, with different parts to it could theoretically work. And then the radical right within Israel would be the minority that would be isolated by the vast majority of the population that would say, look, this is for our good, and we're voting you out of any power whatsoever. Unfortunately, the radicalization on both sides is deepening. And many Israelis, you have to remember the kibbutzim that were wiped out or largely decimated on October 7th, these were left-leaning places. These were peace-loving places. The Nova Music Festival, no, these weren't godly, God-fearing people. These were kids, the new age and drug using and partying, but they're the peace lovers. They're the peaceniks, wanting to work side by side. Some of the people that were slaughtered by Hamas actually went into Gaza regularly to get patients that needed treatment and to bring them into Israeli hospitals for treatment. So now they're like, we can't trust anybody. We thought there were good Palestinians and bad, but it seems they all hate us. So the radicalization is getting deeper in all quarters, but the ideal solution would involve some other Arab nations, wealthy Arab nations who right now say they don't want to be part of this, but it would involve them getting involved and say, okay, let's give some governance here. Let's have some non-radical leadership. And then as Israel would say, okay, we want to pour into you. We want to open our borders. Remember before this that Israel had opened the borders to Gaza. This was another hope, that giving jobs to more and more people. So thousands of Gazans came into Israel every day for work. I think the number was over 18,000 daily, could be even higher. Israel thinking, let's just do this. And they'll see they're getting jobs there, and we're neighbors. And of course, it backfires. So that's the idealistic view. I don't know how it can be implemented.
Well, Luis, I know you've been waiting there patiently. Let me go ahead and pass it over to you to ask a few questions.
Yeah. So I do have a couple of questions, but first I want to mention where I'm coming from in all this. So I kind of go back and forth on this one because I have a lot of close friends on both sides of this conflict, and whenever I listen to them, I can say that, yeah, I do see your point. And whenever I read the news, it does seem like there is plenty of blame to go around. So there are times when Hamas really does seem to be doing a lot of bad, but there's also times where it seems that the IDF is the one to blame. But I do have a couple of what I would say general questions. The first one has to do with what you said before about how you can be pro-Israel without accepting or legitimizing everything the Israeli government has done. So in your view, what would be some legitimate criticisms that could be leveled towards the Israeli government, past and present?
So the current government is constituted for Netanyahu to stay in power. He made alliance with far right, even radical people. So Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, these men could rightly be called racist and dangerous, that should not be in power. I have no hesitation saying that whatsoever, that they're pushing Israel in a wrong direction. There are radical right-wing settlers who have taken it on themselves to be vigilantes and who have committed acts of violence against local Palestinians. Absolutely wrong. Again, for Netanyahu to be in power, he had to make a coalition with religious right, and religious right will then immediately get the Ministry of Interior. Ministry of Interior would try to keep people like me, Messianic Jews, from getting citizenship in the land. So there would be, although you can freely practice your faith within Israel, and as an Israeli citizen, you can freely evangelize, stand on a street corner and preach, you can do that. But there's definitely some level of religious discrimination against Jewish believers because of this system there. Those would be, some things that would come to mind immediately. And again, the radical settlers, that's a big concern, because their view is basically, this is our land, period. And the Arabs are second-class citizens at best. And then although it is absolutely wrong to say that Israel is an apartheid state, even the Arab Israelis living within the country, many will say that they're treated with equality, that they have absolute freedom there. We know for a fact that the vast majority do not want to be under Hamas or Palestinian Authority. In other words, they much prefer living in Israel under Israeli leadership. But many of them do feel like second-class citizens in the land, do feel some level of discrimination. Israel went out of its way sacrificially to bring in Ethiopian Jews, but then it's in certain cases they have not been as fully incorporated and as welcomed. In some cases, it's even due to racism there. So, and then if we want to keep going, is Israel's leftist tendencies. You know, Tel Aviv was voted the most gay-friendly city in the world some years ago. It's become known for in the pornography circles for the manufacture of gay porn. You have gay pride events in Tel Aviv annually that are massive. You even have gay pride events in Jerusalem. Women serving in the IDF can get free abortions. So, you know, these are some of many issues that I have with Israel as a believer myself, as a Jewish person. And I'm free to bring those, and there's nothing anti-Semitic. And no one would consider that anti-Semitic in terms of the criticisms that I brought. I don't know if that's a decent enough starting point list for you.
I think it's a good starting point, because I think a lot of people's concerns about Israeli society are really concerns about the far right, you know, those Kahanist groups and whatnot. And maybe if they weren't around, the narrative would be very different.
Let me just say this: it's that they've had being around. There's no problem, and Israel is a very free society, and really does try to operate on certain moral principles. Just research the ethics card that every Israeli soldier has to carry. When they start their training, the opening weeks are about ethics and how to conduct oneself. But you literally cannot leave your base without your ID and without your ethics card. But the problem is not having these diverse groups. We have them all over America, right? The problem is empowering them. The problem is giving them weight in the government. If they remain a tiny little party that people voted in, okay, that's fine. You could vote them in. But when they become part of the government coalition, where you have 4 seats, but your 4 seats are necessary for me to get over a 60 seats, now I've given you disproportionate power. That is the real danger. So it's not their presence. You're always going to have radicals on all sides in a society. It's their empowering. And now, because of the evil of Hamas, their self-justification in what they do. So they should be called out. They should be called out and recognized as dangerous, 100%. And most of Israel has had that position up to now, but things are swinging further right because of the ongoing war.
Yes. So on a somewhat related note, so you mentioned that, you know, there's no clear solution right now, but maybe there are some steps that we could take. And Israel has done some stuff, made some concessions. Now, you know, but there's some debate as to whether those are sufficient or not. But in your view, other than the ones that you've already mentioned, what other reasonable compromises do you think Israel can and ought to make with the Palestinians so that they can secure peace without necessarily jeopardizing freedom or security for both sides?
Yeah. Okay. So it's very complex. I don't know what they can do with Gaza right now, because it's under Hamas control, and it's so radicalized, and the people as a whole have been largely radicalized. I was at a university in India, part of a presentation at an international school, about 700 international students out of 150,000 at Andhra University. And I don't know, maybe 50, 60 of these students came together for a discussion group, and I was brought in as part of it. And two of the young men there were from Gaza, one was from Syria. And when we had open dialogue and interaction, they assured me that Hamas did not rape anyone on October 7th, that they did not kill any babies or behead any children, that Hamas had no terror tunnels under hospitals, that this was all IDF fabrication. When I went to shake one man's hand, he refused. He said, "The blood of my family is on your hands." And he was just a college student, you know, and speaking about ethics and morality and equality and all of this. So the radicalization is so deep. I don't know what can be done in Gaza, other than what I'm saying, that it's rebuilt together with Israel's help in such a way that everyone knows we're giving you a better. Hamas is gone, the ideology is gone, and now we've got a more moderate leadership offering you a better future. In terms of Judea, Samaria, I was at a conference, the Christ at the Checkpoint conference in 2018. It's absolutely anti-Zionist, and I've even called it out as being anti-Semitic. That's why I was asked to speak, to bring a different viewpoint. And I went to every meeting they asked me to go to. I met with young people that told me the horrors they've experienced. I took a tour of the city of Hebron and saw the challenges that the people go through there. Of course, all the checkpoints. If there could be new leadership, get rid of Abbas. And the one thing the local Palestinians will tell you is their leadership is corrupt. Their leadership has become billionaires for money that should have gone to them. And remember, all the international money that's come in for the refugees and the hurting people in Gaza, etc., that's gone into terror tunnels and into weaponry, not to the betterment of the people. So get the money to the people, get different leaders in that will not be corrupt, and then within then in the West Bank, protect the Palestinians from the radical settlers. Make clear that they are acting on their own and Israel is standing against their actions. And Israel does its level best to make sure that good resources are not taken from the Palestinians in favor of Israelis, and say, let's do what we can to enhance your jobs. Remember, when people call for BDS, it hurts Palestinians because it hurts their jobs as well. So let's try once again. Let's get a fresh start of bringing in businesses and other things that will help up your economy. And to the extent you can 100% weed out terrorism, 100% weed out the indoctrination of children and terrorist ideas, then let Israel keep bending over backwards to raise the level of standard of life for those in Judea, Samaria, in the West Bank. Maybe they could do better there. But again, it's just one of those difficult impasses. It's almost like a husband and wife. Unless you can get them in the same room and each one willing to get low, you're not going to get a solution. So in my view, the problems for the Palestinian people are primarily the fault of the Palestinian leadership, but Israel is far from perfect. And not just the radicals among them, just some of the policies have been detrimental to Palestinians, and Israel could do better. So I weighted the great majority of the guilt on the side of the Palestinians, but Israel could definitely do better and needs to not react emotionally to what happened on October 7th and still try to look for the long-term solution.
Yeah, you mentioned the extreme settlers. Actually, I did want to ask a question relating to the settlements. So that is one of the major points of criticism by those on the Palestinian side. And there's two elements to it. One is that they say the settlements are a violation of the Oslo Accords, which Israel agreed to. The other is that those settlers are actually pushing out existing Palestinian inhabitants. So maybe can you speak to that one?
Yeah, well, number one, the Oslo Accords were rejected by the Palestinians, so that's a moot point. There is no international law. These are, Israel calls these disputed territories, but then operates legally based on world definitions of occupied territories. So Israel does have the right then to expand, to settle, because they are controlling these disputed territories now. But there are cases where Palestinians are being displaced wrongfully, and where those exist, the Israeli government needs to stand with the Palestinians against those who are displacing. So where it does exist, and I've read different reports, I've not had the time to come to firm conclusions as to what's happening, as much as the he said, she said. So I want to be candid on that. But to the extent it is happening, if it is happening, there can be no displacing of those who already live where they live. That should not be happening. If it is, and again, I'm saying if, then Israel needs to actively work against those settlers and stand with the Palestinians.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I do have at least two more questions. Both of them are directly related to the Gaza conflict. One
Please.
has to do with the idea of disproportionate force. Now, some, people who defend Israel will say that maybe individual soldiers will engage in disproportionate force, but that's not a matter of military identity, a military policy. But the counter argument to that is that there is an actual military doctrine called the Dahia Doctrine, which was mentioned by General Gadi Eisenkot after the Lebanese village that was leveled in the Lebanon War, saying that he basically said that yes, there is an actual military doctrine in the IDF that includes the leveling of civilian villages or in habitations as a matter of basically a form of deterrence against hostile populations. Maybe you can explain whether that's an actual policy and where does this idea come from and how we make sense of it.
Right. So number one, Israel recognizes the issue of proportionality. It does understand that concept and is glad to be judged by it. That's the first thing. The second thing is all standards have to be the same. Israel cannot be held to a particular standard. So what percentage of civilians were killed when the Allies took out the Nazis in Germany? Very, very high number of civilian casualties, a shocking number. It had to be done. It was the only way to win the war and stop something far worse from happening. So Israel is going to examine everything. One of the punishments for if there's someone who's a terrorist, Israel will destroy the house of that terrorist. And it's a way, and also understanding that the family and everyone was complicit in it. But Israel's doing this as deterrence. So these are things that have to be weighed out in equal measure in terms of, let's review the history of warfare. In modern war, what's considered proportionate, what's considered disproportionate. When it comes to Gaza and the current war there, for sure, Israel is doing its best to minimize civilian casualties, but are there things it's doing that are wrong? For example, has there been corporate punishment of the people as a whole? When Israel stopped electrical power and things like that for coming in, was that corporate punishment of the people? Others would say, well, Israel is supplying the power for free. They had no obligation to do it, and Egypt could help, and Egypt wasn't helping. So why should Israel continue to supply power to people that are trying to annihilate them? But some of the intense pressure at the beginning was with the direct goal of trying to get the hostages freed. Within a matter of days, that was changed. So there was not an ongoing corporate punishment of the people. And again, just look at what's happening now at the moment, that Israel, yes, under pressure from America, but it was its own plan, has evacuated almost 1 million out of 1.3 million Gazans that were in Rafah outside, set up, tent camps, etc., and would gladly get humanitarian aid to help as much as possible before carrying out their offensive, even though waiting means more people die, more hostages could die. They've still sought to do it. But the overall question of proportionality will ultimately be evaluated when the war is over and we can get an accurate account of civilian deaths. We can see which civilian deaths could have been prevented, or where, look, I've heard reports of starvation. And then I talked to a friend on the ground. He said, there is no starvation. There adequate supplies are coming in, and it's Hamas that's often stopping them from coming in. By the way, to backtrack, there are ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel who have tried to stop supplies from going into Gaza. They have physically tried to stop trucks. There's an ultra-Orthodox rabbi who blessed them in doing it. That's reprehensible. He's saying you're empowering Hamas, you're empowering the murderers. That's reprehensible. And yes, there's been a problem with the aid coming in, that Hamas steals it and uses it for themselves, and the people don't get it. But that's a reprehensible act by some within Israel, but again, represents the radical right. We'll ultimately be able to say if there was any type of a war crime on any level with Israel. Once all the dust settles, everything's evaluated, we can find out the degree to which Hamas was embedded in the civilian population, the degree to which Israel had no alternative but to wage war certain ways, and whether things were disproportionate or not. Those are all fair questions that should be asked once the dust settles.
So I do have one more question. It has to do with the claim that the reason why some of this collateral damage happens is because Hamas is using human shields. They're operating out of hospitals and whatnot. I hear this all the time as sort of like a talking point. But I've seen that this is not always verified. So, for example, with the Al-Shifa hospital, there's been questions about was Hamas actually using it as a command control center? The evidence still seems a little inconclusive on that. And then at least one case, the IDF claimed that ambulance was being used by the Hamas for military purposes, but then Human Rights Watch came in and said, actually, we didn't find any evidence that this was the case. So I guess I could say, can all these claims that Hamas is using human shields or civilian buildings for military purposes actually verified or justified?
Overwhelmingly, it's undeniable. Overwhelmingly, it's been a known strategy for decades. And basically, if I said here are 100 points proving this, and you said, well, 3 of them are questionable. Okay, 3 out of 100 are questionable, 97 are not. So that's undeniable. It's been known. It's been documented. It's been a strategy. Yasser Arafat did it in the days of the PLO. Again, it's been known, and they vocally said it. We're a nation of martyrs, and it's fine if we lose hundreds of thousands of our people in the cause. In fact, it helps them. It helps their whole cause. It helps turn the world against Israel. So it's known strategy. There's nothing to dispute it there. There may be a case here and there, mistaken identification, but look, I've watched the actual footage where Israel is about to bomb, and they say, okay, there's still a civilian, we can't do it yet, and they pull back, or okay, we can't guarantee that this is the case, and therefore we're not striking. So if there was a strike and it turned out afterwards to be erroneous, right, then that's an error. In other words, they did their best. They understood that it was a Hamas target, and it turned out not to be, if that was the case. But I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but be very careful with groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International when it comes to Israel. They have been exposed for extraordinary double standards. Or just look for UN, just go to unwatch.org and see what's documented there on the UN level. But this has been carefully documented. There's a book by Ben Dror Yamini, and it's about fabrications of lies about Israel, and it's carefully documented by someone who used to be radical left. And then the more they researched, got into things, the more they found where the truth lay. But you'd have to, again, there may be an example here and there, in which case Israel had bad intelligence, but Hamas doing what it does, weaponry in children's schools, bombing from locations where they bomb, there would not be 300 Israeli soldiers killed if this was just a regular war of combatants. They're being killed because of the nature of the guerrilla warfare and where Hamas is and being in homes. And also remember that on October 7th, civilians participated. It wasn't just Hamas leaders. Civilians participated. Hostages have been held in the homes of civilians. So there's been a whole lot more working together than most would want to admit. But overwhelmingly, the human shield narrative is a fact, and it's been well documented for decades.
Dr. Brown, I know we're up against the clock, and I want to be respectful to your time. So very quickly, last question, super chat from Tony. Thank you. Other than because that is what they do, why would the media continue to perpetuate the genocidal narrative? Fake news? What is your view here?
It's several reasons. One, the reason it's taken on college campuses, it's the indoctrination of a society that you have the oppressor and the oppressed, the colonizer and the colonized. And the ultimate evil one is the white European male, which now becomes the Zionist Jew. That's one thing. The other thing is anti-Semitism is demonic. It's the world's longest hatred. It's the world's most widespread hatred. It's the world's most irrational hatred. And this is part of just people buying the latest lie against Israel. And that's the way it's going to be. I mean, it happened in biblical times. You know, read the book of Esther. It's happened through history. It happened in Greco-Roman history. It's happened that parts of the church have adopted anti-Semitic narratives. Islam adopted anti-Semitic narratives. Atheists adopted anti-Semitic narratives. It's a demonic thing. It's a spiritual phenomenon above all. And that's why it gets perpetuated.
And where can people go to find out more information about yourself and your perspective?
Yeah, go to thelineoffire.org, thelineoffire.org. Just search for Israel. You'll see tons of videos, of articles. And then my book, Our Hands Are Stained with Blood, The Tragic Story of the Church and the Jewish People, the 2019 edition, Our Hands Are Stained with Blood, The Tragic Story of the Church and the Jewish People. If you have the courage, read that book. It'll be an extraordinary eye-opener and one that I hope will sensitize your heart. And again, to end here, I grieve over the suffering of the Palestinian people. Even if Israel was completely justified in all of its actions, I think it's justified in many, but not all. Even if it was justified in all, it's tragic, it's horrific, it's terrible suffering. And these people, even if they support Hamas, they're victims as well. They've been indoctrinated. And our hearts should go out to them. And as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we want Jew and Muslim to know Jesus. And that's our ultimate goal in all of this. But thanks for the questions. And I know you could probe even more deeply, but hopefully we were able to give some helpful answers.
Yeah, I think it was very productive. And thank you so much for coming on and doing this. It was truly an honor.
Yeah, thank you, Louis. Appreciate it. Mm-hmm. And let's listen to both. Let's continue to listen to both sides with open hearts and minds. Yes?
Absolutely.
All right. God bless. Thank you.
God bless. Everybody hit the like button and the subscribe button. We'll see you later.